Hey everyone, welcome to our 5-minute Bible study series. Today we're talking about 1 Samuel chapter 13. There's a free PDF that you're going to see up on the screen, but you can also download it on our website at tobelikechrist.com. Let's talk about this chapter. When did the events of this chapter take place? Well, we've been talking about Saul, the first king of Israel. He became king approximately 1050 BC, and the events of this chapter happened several years after he became king. The key characters for this chapter are Saul, as we just mentioned. He's the first king of Israel after the period of the judges. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. We're also going to talk about Samuel. He was God's prophet, and he delivered God's messages to Saul and to the people of Israel. He was the last significant judge of the nation. And then Jonathan. Jonathan is actually Saul's son, and he was an honorable young man, and he was a great warrior, we find out. And then the Philistines, we've talked about them before. This was a nation of people. They were the longtime enemies of the Israelites. Where did these events play out? Well, Jonathan defeated a Philistine garrison in a place called Geba, which was approximately 4 miles to the northeast of Gibeah, which we've talked about quite a bit and which is on the map. The Philistine army was camped at a place called Michmash, and then Saul waited for 7 days for Samuel at Gilgal. We'll talk about why he was waiting and what happened during those 7 days in our outline. Now, for that outline section, verses 1 through 7 is our first section. The Philistines scare the Israelites with a massive army. So when Saul had reigned in Israel for several years, his son Jonathan defeated a Philistine garrison at Geba, which we just mentioned. This really infuriated the Philistines, and they brought a massive army out against the Israelites to fight with them, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops. The Philistines camped at a place called Michmash. Saul gathered the fighting men of Israel to counter their offensive, but the men of Israel were terrified of the Philistines. In fact, the people, it seems like the common people, were hiding in basically anywhere that they could find: caves, holes, rocks, tombs, cisterns, and some even crossed the Jordan River and went east, basically going anywhere that they could escape the Philistines. Now, our second section, verses 8 through 18, Saul's sinful sacrifice. And this is quite a significant moment in the reign of Saul. Samuel told Saul that he was going to meet him at Gilgal within 7 days to offer a sacrifice and to ask for the Lord's help with the battle. But at the end of the 7 days, there was no sign of Samuel, and so Saul decided to take things into his own hands and to offer the sacrifice himself. Well, as soon as he did this, Samuel showed up. And Samuel was really angry with Saul because he wasn't authorized to offer sacrifices. He was the king of Israel, yes, but he was not the priest of Israel, and this was an overstep of his authority. We'll talk about that more in our application section. Saul tried to make excuses for what he had done and thought he had good reasons, but Samuel wasn't interested in listening to his excuses. Saul was told that he was going to be punished for doing this. And in the coming generations, the kingdom of Israel would not be ruled by his descendants, his children, but rather it would be given to another man and to another family. Samuel then left Gilgal, and Saul took his men to Geba. And we're told that the Philistines were sending out raiding parties. Specifically, they sent out 3 raiding parties, and so the threat was very real against Israel. Our final section takes us through verse 23, and we're going to talk about the superior weaponry of the Philistines. So the text tells us that there were no blacksmiths in Israel at that time. The Israelites were used to going to the Philistines to get their smithing done, like getting their plowshares and their axes and their sickles sharpened. Therefore, Saul's army, when it came time for war, they had a very limited number of weapons, because who typically makes and sharpens weapons? Well, blacksmiths. So that is where chapter 13 leaves off. We'll pick the story back up again in chapter 14. Now for our application. You may have had the same question as you were working through the text. What was so bad about Saul offering the sacrifice? Was it really that big of a deal? From his point of view, didn't he have good reasons for doing it? Well, in part, it was that he, as the king, felt that he had the liberty, that he could step into a role that God hadn't assigned him. God had permitted Saul to be the king, but Saul didn't have the authority to overrule God's religious system. Saul was supposed to be in submission to that religious system. He forgot his place, and that was the problem. The application for us is that we need to be careful that we don't feel at liberty to step into roles that God hasn't assigned to us, or to appoint people to roles in a way that's contrary to God's instructions. There's a number of ways that this could potentially play out, and a number of places that this could be applied, but the most obvious one probably is in churches. Sometimes you see churches appointing people to positions that God hasn't authorized those people to fill. Maybe it's women as overseers, as elders of the church. Maybe it's male elders of the church who don't meet the qualifications that are given in the New Testament in books like Timothy and Titus. And you can also see this in the family life, an individual's life. God has called men to lead the household. And what if a man says, well, I'd rather just take the passive supportive role and I'll let my wife lead? Well, that's not a role that God has authorized you to take, right? So, and vice versa. So anyway, a number of ways that this could be applied, but in the case of those churches may feel like they have good reasons to appoint people to these positions. Maybe you think that you have good reasons to take a different family role other than the one that God has assigned you. But in doing that, we're making the same mistake that Saul was making. We are forgetting our place. We're forgetting that we are to be in submission to God's system and that we don't have the option to overrule it or to sidestep it.